the Fish Advisory Outreach Program Manager. I do a lot of work on the Hudson River, but also now more across the state as well. I'm here with my coworker Thomas Sweck, who's going to have a poster later, so you guys should come talk to us. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we've done to try to really turn our advisories, which typically point out waters that aren't really the greatest to eat at, and try to help anglers make better choices. And so we've done a lot of that work through a mapping program that sort of highlights our advisories. So DOH has been setting advice for really 50 years at this point. And we do that in conjunction with DEC. We work very closely with DEC. DEC is responsible for the collecting and the analyzing of the fish. For the most part, we also work with our federal partners, but in New York State, it's mostly DEC. And then DOH will analyze the data and set advice. And these advisories are based both on health-based guidelines that our toxicologists set, as well as a variety of risk management factors. Some of these involve quantity and quality of the data, the length of time, if it's a remediation site, whether there are positive trends or negative trends. And we have special considerations as well for sensitive populations, so anyone who can get pregnant and children under 15. A lot of these chemicals are, can cause developmental issues and are much worse for children especially. And we really try to balance the risk of exposure to some of these chemicals with the benefits of actually eating the fish. Because obviously eating fish is very healthy for you, and it's not just the eating part that is good, it's also the actual fishing and the socializing and being out in nature. There are really 3 different types of advice in New York State. So the primary one is specific advisories. So these are waters where we have data for these fish. They've come back higher than our guidelines, and based on our risk management factors, we've decided to go ahead and issue a specific advisory. This typically will limit some fish. It may be for both populations. It may only be for the sensitive population. It just depends on which one. There are about 140 waters right now in New York State that have specific advice. And there's a variety of chemicals that typically trigger advisories in New York State. That includes PCBs, mercury, PFAS, and then some of our older chemicals, Murex, chloridane, and dieldrin. There are a handful of advisories for those left, but for the most part, it's really PCBs, mercury, and PFAS at this point. Typically, the specific advice is also, it's more protective for the sensitive population, so it has more restrictive advice. And then in addition to specific advisories, there are mercury-based regional advisories. So we have regional advisories for both the Adirondack and the Catskill region, and then last year we issued statewide advice, which really tries to point people towards lower mercury species. So the Adirondacks are our most affected area for mercury. That's probably the most restrictive, it is the most restrictive regional advice in New York State. Larger walleye are unfortunately don't eat. I presented a little bit on this last year. Catskills are sort of like the second most affected by mercury. And then our statewide advice has more options for both the general population and for the sensitive population. But some of our larger smallmouth bass and walleye are still pretty restrictive. And when you're comparing those walleye mercury levels to like commercial fish, some of our walleye are actually pretty much as high as like your swordfish or your tuna or your shark in some of our waters. So that is why that advice is so restrictive. So, Thomas and I, we spend a lot of time out doing outreach to anglers, answering a lot of questions. And we've always been asked, okay, so these are the places I can't eat the fish. So where can I eat the fish? And for a long time, we didn't have an answer to that because the program was really just focused on specific advisories. But as an outreach person, right, we're the ones that are in front of the people all the time, and that was, people wanted to know this. It was obviously like a kind of a negative message, especially for some of the areas that are really affected by restrictive advice, like Onondaga Lake or the Hudson River. And so we know that positive messaging, it really helps to empower anglers to make their own decisions, and it really encourages them to follow the advice. And so we wanted to be able to help families really determine where they can eat the fish as healthier alternatives to some of these impacted waters. So we know that maps essentially help people make better choices. So for the past like 10 years, essentially, and this goes back to Kristen's time at DOH before she was with DEC, we've been working on essentially these color-coded county maps. And we have over 21 counties available now. It's online. It's an ongoing project, and it's pretty labor-intensive, but they're really helpful. And essentially, it shows people which advisories apply to which waters, how far those advisories apply, and also it gives you like a really quick at-a-glance to tell you where those better choice waters are. So this is an example I'm showing here of Onondaga County, where you really, like, everyone knows that Onondaga Lake, right, has some pretty hefty advice, but, you know, that also applies to the tributaries. So these maps kind of show the spider web that's, you know, all the tributaries going out of Onondaga Lake up to the first impassable barrier. So we have this, like, caveat. We call it the tributary rule, right? So specific advice for a water body also applies to smaller tributaries and connected waters if there are no dams, falls, or other barriers to stop the fish from moving upstream or downstream. This is because the chemicals remain in fish when they move from one water body or location to another. So yes, we know that fish move, right? And there are like all sorts of interesting situations that we've gotten to over the years as we've been researching these barriers and these tributaries, where we do have to make sort of an educated decision based on the data that we have, if, you know, especially if a place has robust data, and also rely on the help of the regional fish managers because they know their waters and they know their fisheries best. So as I mentioned, right, if you just look at our advice, which like the top part of that table, that's like your typical, that's the typical table that you would find on our website. It says Onondaga Lake, but it doesn't also list all these other waters. So the maps really are an important resource to help anglers understand the lay of the land and how far these advisories do or don't apply. And you know, I'm all about trying to take some of the sleuthing out of the work for the angler, because the more complicated it gets, the less compliance you have, right? The less likely they are to actually follow this advice. So what constitutes impassable? Well, Croton, yes, definitely, that is impassable, right? But that next one, you know, it looks like it's breached, maybe slated to come down. There's a lot of work that's happening right now with dam removals to increase habitat, but as that happens, right, as those fish are able to move further, so that's something that we try to keep an eye on and we try to take into account when we're making the maps to make sure that, you know, those advisories have to expand sometimes. So there's dams, waterfalls, right? Sometimes rapids and riffles will be a barrier. Thermal barriers are occasionally considered especially when regional managers bring this up. Sheer distance. Sometimes there's just a really, really flat river, right? And it just like, if there's walleye, they're going to use that whole stretch. Habitat, right? Like, if there's like a nice lake versus this like marshy, tiny little outlet, like our fish, our sizable fish of you know, catching length, really going to be using both of those areas. You know, again, we will rely on the regional managers for that, and culverts can oftentimes be impassable as well. So we use a variety of different resources to be able to make our maps. We also write technical documents pretty much as a background document that really analyzes whatever the barrier is so that we have a good understanding. We can go back to it because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of dams and streams. And what we found out very early on is that if you don't write it down, you're going to forget. So there's a variety of different resources that we use, and Thomas's poster is going to go into a little bit more of that, so you can come talk to us after. And the maps have been really important for us to work with our newcomer populations. We've been using them heavily over the past probably 6 or 7 years, especially for English as a new language populations. And we've done a lot of work with Burmese and Karen-speaking anglers in the past few years, because they fundamentally show where to eat the fish and where to avoid. And it's really the most basic of our messages are kind of boiled down in these maps. So this is like an example of, for our Syracuse population of Burmese and Karen-speaking anglers, this is like the spread on the inside of the guide, where we point them to public access locations. And we really try to make sure that these locations are sort of like very clear public access points. We typically do not point E&L or like newcomer populations to public fishing rights or trout streams, just because sometimes it's like, I don't, the private access, and like if people get angry about people accessing locations, it's too much of a liability. So we stick to the obvious parks and lakes and make sure that it's a safe experience. Not all of these cultures are used to using maps. So this was something that we did hire somebody from the Karen community that sort of helped us talk through and figure out how we were going to present these. And it worked better for some community members than others. We're actually right in the middle of doing a big project with scripting sort of read aloud videos to bridge some of the literacy issues that we found in particular with this community. So that's something that we're working on this year, which is pretty cool. And just trying to point people to good places to eat the fish. And then we're continuing to experiment with the maps and trying to expand resources for different English as new language populations. So this is an example. We were requested, there's actually, through our EPA counterparts, we were requested to essentially make a specific resource for Lake Champlain in Plattsburgh. There are people that speak Spanish, Haitian Creole, and French as well. And so they wanted something that was quick and dirty, like the most basic info in the 4 languages that we could just hand out. Unfortunately, Plattsburgh does have issues around the Cumberland Bay area still, but the rest of the lake is pretty good. It's just the Adirondack Regional Advisory. So this is just an example of essentially like a small brochure that we're working on specifically for these populations. And this is something that we've used in other places, especially in the Hudson Valley. Quick and short. Any questions?
So one of the slides you talked about Burmese and Karen speaking
Yep.
people. Is there a huge population of that ethnic group?
Yes.
Yes. Where would that be in the state?
So in New York State, there's a large population in Albany. There's some in Syracuse. There's Rochester, Utica. So 30%